Um, wow, this has been an incredible day. I don't know how I'm going to follow this incredible lineup of wonderful talks. It's just been exceptional. So thank you so much for the platform and for all of these people coming together who've all been affected by bone cancer in some way. It's pretty humbling to be up here. Today I want to talk to you about the language of cancer. Before I begin the talk, I just want to say a couple things. The first is that any opinions or ideas that I share are my own, and any concepts or statistics that I share will be referenced at the end. And I hope that you find the talk insightful and applicable to your life, whether you're a patient, a supporter, or a healthcarer. Okay, this is me. I am Krista Bose. I'm Canadian. I'm also American and Swiss, and I moved to the UK 7 years ago. I did my undergraduate degree at the University of Western Ontario in Canada, and I spent a year abroad in Singapore, where I did a major in English language and literature, which is why I'm interested in language particularly. I did my graduate entry MBBS degree at St. George's University in London, which is where 24 Hours in A&E is filmed, for reference. And I'm a doctor. I qualified as a doctor in June of 2021, just over a year ago. And in my role as a doctor, I meet cancer patients every day. I have a lot of very sensitive and heavy conversations telling people in the past that they've had cancer. And I like to think that I'm getting particularly good at these kinds of conversations because I myself have been told that I have cancer. So, I want everybody here to just have a think about language in general and how language in relation to cancer is an important thing to think about. In my personal and my professional life, I've been present when the conversation hasn't gone well, and I feel like I'm getting pretty good at what not to say. I've had medical professionals break bad news to me with care and compassion, but I've also had some of the worst consultations ever, featuring some really terrible communication skills. I've been given unwelcome advice, as I'm sure many of you have. I've been called a brave warrior many, many times, and I've had a lot of friends and family members reach out to me to tell me that they wanted to get in touch, but they didn't know what to say. This is why I want to talk about language today. So everybody in the room, if you're a healthcarer or a researcher, I want you to think about a time when you've ever spoken to a patient or if you've ever had to break bad news when it didn't go well. If you're a supporter, I want you to think about a time where you might have said the wrong thing or didn't know what to say. And if you have been diagnosed with cancer, I want you to think about a time when poor communication affected your care or your mindset, including times when that language was coming from you yourself. I'm expecting that based on my experiences as a doctor and as a cancer patient, and based on the stories I've heard from friends in the cancer community, that all of you will have some example, if not multiple examples, of how the wrong words can make a bit of a mess of things. So, language is important. The words we choose, the words we offer to others or to ourselves, whether they are thought, written, or spoken, are critical to our health and to our happiness. So today I want to talk about different aspects of language and the language of cancer, and I want to talk about the language that healthcare professionals use, like jargon. I'll talk about the language of the media and advertisers, the language of your friends and family members, and the language and self-talk that we use with ourselves. Okay, here we go. So the first aspect of this is medical jargon and language, which most of us have heard in our diagnosis, in the diagnosis of a loved one, or we use these terms a lot in our jobs. But I just want to check, does everyone know the meaning of these words that are used in relation to their diagnosis? To the healthcarers or the researchers in the room, do you explain or define these medical terms to your patients when you use these words? Do you ever feel reluctant to use any of these words? And to the people in the room who've been diagnosed, do any of these words scare you? Do any of these words, when applied to you, make you feel uncomfortable or misunderstood? These words have power, and if there's not precision of language used with these words, it can be very devastating. I personally have a hard time with some of these words, and I want to talk about two particularly today. The first word that I want to talk about is palliative. I misunderstood this word when I was first diagnosed. So here's a little anecdote for you. Once upon a time, back in 2018, I was an inpatient in hospital for treatment of neutropenic sepsis post-chemotherapy, which I had after every single round of chemo. And I was at my local hospital, St. George's, as a patient, curled up in bed. I was looking rough. I was wheelchair-bound, bald, skinny, neutropenic, and ulcerated. But I was just keeping my head down, and I thought I would just keep turning up for treatment and see how it went. And when you're living this chemo life gradually, you don't always realize how sick you look. And so on this admission, while I was hooked up to my medication and to my antibiotics, the palliative care team slowly approached my bedside, and I took off like a rocket. I was out of the bed, into the chair, pulling lines out, saying, "I am not dying today, do not come and see me." But lucky for me, these nurses, they were not put off, and they very calmly told me that they were here for pain control, they were not here for me to die, they were here to live a little easier. They hooked me up to a syringe driver, which offered me a continuous flow of pain relief and comfort. So I want to put up the definitions now. You don't need to read them all. But just look at the highlighted words for palliative. It's providing relief from the symptoms of disease. I think there's a misunderstanding with this word a lot, and it evokes a lot of fear sometimes, which is unnecessary because it's actually such a big part of treatment. I know it is really relevant within end-of-life care, but it's relevant all the way through for anyone who's going to have a chronic illness or something that they're dealing with long-term. I hope that many of us will live very beautiful, long lives, potentially even with advanced cancer for years, especially as the treatment lines continue to improve. And I dare say all of us with cancer will have symptoms at some point along the way. So I hope if that you ever come to meet a palliative care team, you do not think of them as the Grim Reapers like I did my first day. And you're open to hearing what they have to say, and hopefully they can make any of your experiences and symptoms better. The second word that I want to talk about is the word incurable. I don't really like this word. I've had it applied to me by medical professionals in the past, and I've known many other people in the cancer community to use this word for themselves, but I just can't get behind it. I just don't feel that it leaves space for the potential of the future of science and research and medicine. When I started my very first line of treatment 4 years ago, the fourth line medication that I'm taking now wasn't in use for sarcoma patients at the time. If I was the stage that I'm at now 4 years ago, my time might have ended much sooner. 4 years, that's it. And these advancements have bought me a lot of precious time. So I don't like to call myself incurable, because I like to leave room for all of the what ifs, which many people in this room right now are working on, researching, funding, inspiring, supporting, and crossing their fingers for. These what ifs that I think about on a daily basis. So thank you to everyone here who's working on the what ifs. When you go to medical school, you have to learn how to break bad news and how to talk to patients about their cancer diagnosis. For the medical professionals in the room that have had to tell someone that they have cancer, I'm really sorry that you've had to do this as part of your job. It's not easy. Preparing mentally for these conversations is such a hard thing to do, I know, for myself. But if you practice this and you prepare for these conversations, you and your patients will be better off for it. It might be a very small part of a very busy day for a doctor, but I think a lot of people in this room know that these words, when said wrong, can haunt you forever. So use precise, simple language. If you're going to use jargon, explain the terms. Learn how to break bad news effectively. In medical school, we're taught this SPIKES acronym, and I wonder from the patients in the room, people who've been diagnosed, if this was anything like what you were taught or told when you were given your diagnosis. I expect for a lot of people there will be things missing, and it wouldn't have been, completely as it should be. But the setting should be thought about. It should be quiet. You should have somewhere private. The patient's perception should be taken into account. Do they think it's cancer? It sounds like there's been some stories today of people who were not expecting it and opened a letter. I mean, I think that's not good enough. Then proceeding with the conversation in bursts, often you see commercials about people receiving their diagnosis and remembering nothing else after. It becomes a blur or a static. So instead of giving all the information at once, chunk it up. And lastly, you need to always go into these conversations with a strategy to move forward. Everyone in the room knows the power of a plan. And when you have a good plan, what a difference that can make to your mindset. For the many people in this room that have been told that they have cancer, I'm very sorry that you had to hear these words. And I hope that the language used that day is not always running through your head. I hope that whoever told you with care and compassion. So this is my first diagnosis. This is a copy of the letter I received after I was told that I had osteosarcoma. I actually found out about my osteosarcoma tumor while I was doing a medical student elective abroad in Prague. And I'd made a bet with one of the consultants that I could get him Wimbledon tennis tickets if he could get me an MRI scan of my leg. Well, that's a long story for another time. But when I got back to the UK, I went through all these different channels and somehow ended up at the Royal National Orthopaedic Hospital in North London. And all I remember from my diagnostic appointment was the surgical consultant telling me I was now non-weight bearing and I needed to leave there in a wheelchair. And I'll also never forget the consultant looking me dead in the eyes and saying very slowly, "I will attempt to save your leg, but only chemotherapy could save your life." And then I turned up. I did several rounds of MAP chemotherapy. I had a limb sparing surgery, which cost me my left femur, knee, the top half of my tibia, and all of my quadricep muscles in my left leg. After surgery, they had a really good look at my tumor under the microscope and found that after 3 months of IV MAP chemo, my tumor had grown significantly. So I switched to a different chemotherapy regime, ifosfamide and etoposide, combined with immunotherapy treatment, which was mifemertide, or MePACT as some people know it. And I finished my chemo in January 2019, and I finished immunotherapy later in July 2019. And then comes the really hard part. Life after cancer, they call it. You're not really the same person. Your body has been carved, irradiated, chemicalized, and wasted in a wheelchair, and you have to rebuild yourself. Your mind, your body, your relationships with others, and with yourself, and you rebuild your life on a bedrock of trauma and hope. And your expectations and your values and goals all change. I thought for a time that I could just put cancer in the past like an achievement ticked off or a challenge completed, and it took me a long time to realize you can't. And in this realization, I did grow. I met a new version of myself. I learned to walk again with the help of a puppy. I returned to medical school and returned to my placements. I started traveling and having fun again. I volunteered for charities, and I went to my monthly checkups for my leg and with my cancer team. I regrew my hair and my muscles and my confidence, and I did quite a lot of walking and hiking, and I grew back. And then comes the really, really hard part. I was diagnosed with metastatic disease in October of 2020, and this diagnosis particularly wasn't communicated well. The setting was in hospital after a lung operation, which I'd had because I was told they thought that I had a benign tumor. What are the odds? They thought I'd had a benign tumor, which was suspected to be endometriosis, which is when you get a lining of your womb growing outside of the womb, other places in the body, and it still sheds like a period. And they thought that was happening in my lung, which is weird. It wasn't. When the medical professional came to tell me after the operation what they'd found, I was still loopy and confused on my general anesthesia hadn't completely worn off yet. My perception was still at that point that it was a benign thing and that it was nothing to worry about. But the invitation to share sensitive information was left out, and the medical professional jumped into my literal worst nightmare, telling me that they found hundreds of tumors in my pleura and that there was nothing they could really do for me. I quickly became very emotional, as it was so unexpected. I was unable to process the news at all, and I began crying and screaming for Oliver, who's my fiancé now. And the healthcare professional was so shocked by my reaction that she got up and left the room. A nurse then came in shortly later to try and comfort me and calm me down. There was no visitors with me because this was in the time of a COVID pandemic, so I was completely alone. And at no point was there any strategy or plan or guidance offered. I was told that same day that I should probably quit medical school, as I would be very unlikely to finish. I was told not to bother applying for foundation training, as if you can't go to medical school, then you can't become a doctor. I was told by my therapist that I should have values rather than having goals, and a lot of words started getting thrown around. Words like incurable, palliative, secondary, metastatic, and even terminal. These words really scared me. Then I started third-line IV chemotherapy, which is gemcitabine and docetaxel. I cold capped to keep my hair. I had a chunk of my left lung removed. You can see the chunk missing in the corner there. I just got on with it and isolated during the pandemic and kept going to chemo. And fortunately, the chemo started working. And I then chose to stop the treatment in order to return to medical school to try and finish my degree, as I wasn't allowed to go to medical school while I was on the chemotherapy, as it made me neutropenic and I wouldn't have been strong enough to go. In the time that I took off treatment, my cancer grew again, and then I started my fourth-line treatment, which is an oral drug that I've gotten on compassionate grounds. It's a tyrosine kinase inhibitor called cabozantinib. So the cabozantinib has been working for me ever since. I finished medical school and I qualified as a doctor. I got a job working for the NHS at a hospital near my home in South London. I got engaged to Oliver, the man who has cared for me throughout all of my treatment lines and who never lets me give up on my dreams. I've since sailed a boat around the Greek Isles. I've gone dog sledding and snowshoeing in the Arctic Circle, and I've climbed some really big mountains on an endoprosthetic leg, all with supposedly palliative, incurable, metastatic terminal cancer. When I received that second diagnosis, I had a lot of expectations. I thought that I would die imminently, as did many of my friends and family. Nobody really knew how much time I had or what lines of treatment would be available or if any of them would work or be successful. I felt like all of my loved ones and supporters were equally traumatized and they were going through the stages of grief with me. A friend of mine created a GoFundMe to help pay for all the unexpected costs that come with cancer, and a small fortune was spent on Ubers and taxis to take me back and forth to chemotherapy in central London during the pandemic when it wouldn't have been safe to take the train due to infection risks. But I learned very slowly and steadily that I could live really well with metastatic cancer, and I could still achieve my big goals. I know that things can always change quickly. I do appreciate that the future is never promised, and I know that I need to make space in my mind for the what ifs. Because if you don't plan for the what ifs, if you don't make space for your big dreams, if you don't save for the wedding or train for the mountains, then they will definitely never happen. And my dark internal monologue that I've gained from having cancer always says at this point, wouldn't you rather die trying? And with this mindset, I found I'm doing a lot of living. So, with all of this in mind, it became really important to me, once I'd come to terms with the reality of being a metastatic cancer patient, that when other people spoke to me about my cancer, I wanted them to use the words and the language that I was comfortable with. Not long after my second diagnosis, I was asked by CNN to do an interview, and I thought, yeah, that's pretty cool. I was happy to do it. It's really good to raise awareness, to say the word sarcoma in an article that people will read. And most of the UK population hasn't even heard the word sarcoma, so this kind of thing is quite important to me. And I did the interview, and they said to me during the interview process that they weren't going to let me read the title or read any of the article before it came out, which I found quite unnerving. And when it did finally come out, the title of the article read, "The world needs all the doctors it can get right now. This terminal cancer patient is risking the time that she has left to become one." And when I read that, my stomach kind of dropped because I hated that they'd called me terminal. I don't want to be terminal, and I didn't consider myself terminal. I figured if I was well enough to attend placement, and if I'm not dying imminently or in the last phase of my life, then I don't really think that that's terminal. So I messaged the writer, and I told him how his language made me feel. I said that I know that you've done this to try and be attention grabbing, but I'm not comfortable with this, and I want you to change it. Luckily, the writer wrote back, and he said that they would fix it, and they could see what they could do. And then they did change the title, and they had to put a little note at the bottom saying the headline of the story has been updated, and I felt so proud of that. This super small change, just taking one word out, helped me appreciate the article, and now I look back on it with pride and gratitude rather than discomfort. Okay. Next, I want to talk to all the supporters in the room, everybody who has loved somebody else with a cancer diagnosis. I have so much respect for all of you. I hope you all appreciate that you are the backbone of this community, and you all help so much in one way or another. It's incredible to have these people in your life. I have some incredible people in my life that are all sat here at my table. And it's so important to have conversations about supporting a loved one with a cancer diagnosis, because one of the things that I get told a lot by especially more distant friends and family is that they don't know what to say, or they're not sure how to talk about your cancer with you. So if you're ever unsure what language you should be using, I would always just take cues from the person who's been diagnosed, and it goes without saying that sometimes they will want to talk about it and other times they won't. And always finishing off a long message to someone you care about with no need to respond right now if they've got a lot going on is always appreciated. But now I want to talk about something that I'm passionate about. It's called the ring theory. This is not my concept. It was a concept developed by a clinical psychologist. She was called Susan Silk. I'm so fond of this. I think it's a great concept. It'll teach you how to support anyone in a crisis. And it doesn't have to be a cancer diagnosis. It could be anything. So here's the little diagram to help explain it. So in the concept, the person in the center of the circle, in this scenario, it'll obviously be someone who'd been diagnosed with cancer. There are always rings of support around the person in the middle. The first ring is usually a spouse or a partner. The second ring might be close friends and family, and then the further out you go, the more distant friends and family gets, and then you have things like colleagues or onlookers. The theory behind this concept is that everyone in the circles should always offer comfort and support inwards. Now, that's not only to the person in the center of the circle, but it means that your family and friends should also be supporting your spouse, and your extended family and friends should be supporting your family. Simultaneously, nobody in the circle is allowed to dump inwards, meaning that everybody venting about their cancer-related stress should dump that out to a larger ring. So here's an example. After I was diagnosed with my second diagnosis, one of my very, very lovely, kind friends called me to cry about how sad she was about my diagnosis, which, although it was her way of being empathetic, it made me more upset. And I've had family members express their stress or their concerns to my partner, Oliver, who's my first ring, and when he's stressed, then I'm stressed, and that's difficult. I've also had onlookers or distant circles made unsolicited comments to my family or friends, which are unhelpful and unsupportive. And that's why dumping out is very, very important in the rings concept. So when talking to someone in a smaller ring than one's own, you can only offer comfort and support. And you shouldn't offer up your own sad feelings about the situation to someone in an inner ring, as it adds to the stress of somewhere closer to the center of the circle. You can apply it if you find it helpful. I find it really helpful. I apply this a lot to anyone in a crisis, and I feel that it has taught me how to support others really well. Next, I want to talk about cancer and social media. Social media has become so big in the world of cancer. There's so many people connecting online, using Instagram or other blogging places, or connecting via all these different online places where people have found people in their community, and it makes you feel so much less alone, which is such an incredible thing. But we do also see a lot of things online that maybe we're not happy with. I know in media especially, when we see cancer patients, it's often images of bald, pale patients that are trying to evoke pity or praise to sell copious amounts of pink toiletries or ribboned baked goods with like 0.00001% actually being donated to research. And we also see the stereotypical portrayal of cancer patients on television and on TV shows. And often a common thread in these presentations is that the cancer patients are brave warriors or inspirational fighters or heroes. But I would like to argue that when cancer patients who are on active treatment are just going through what they have to go through, and what people with disabilities go through on a daily basis, it's not really inherently inspirational. And sometimes being called inspirational when you're doing what you feel like you have no other choice but to do, it can be a bit dismissive. So I want to talk about something called inspiration porn. It's not my term, it's a term that was coined by a disability activist called Stella Young. And it's when able-bodied people or well people suggest that those who are living with a chronic illness or disability are inspirational for doing what an able-bodied person does on a day-to-day basis. Things like working out, driving a car, playing a sport, going to prom, or taking medication. I'd like to argue that these day-to-day activities shouldn't really inherently be inspirational. And it can sometimes make that person feel limited to have that placed upon them. So for example, I want to use these photos by Josh Sundquist, who is amazing. He's a comedian, a professional athlete, and an author, and he had his left leg amputated as a child, as he had Ewing's sarcoma. And he's really famous for these images going viral on social media. But he didn't write this caption. And he comes to social media and talks about this a lot. This went viral sort of without his consent being written. And he says that he doesn't approve or appreciate the caption because it suggests that he should be limited by his disability. He has a really great video about this if you're interested on his Instagram, which is his name, at Josh Sundquist. I've put it again at the end. So in my experience, sometimes the "you're so inspirational" language, especially when you're just going to treatment, it makes me feel at times a little bit uncomfortable. I know that the media or sometimes friends and family feel like they're paying you a compliment, but it can be limiting to have your experience, which is probably one of the worst experiences of your life, be made up to be something that is like so brave and so inspirational, where for you it's just your life and maybe even an awful part of it. So I wanted to show some memes from a cancer account called The Cancer Patient on Instagram to just back me up. I hope you find them funny. They're a bit dark, but it's just, sorry. I found them a bit funny. So if you're supporting someone who's going through treatment, instead of saying, "You're so inspirational," I don't know, I've come up with some other things that I think I would prefer to hear, but I mean, everyone is to each their own. But things like, I'm really sorry you're going through this, or it seems really tough. And one of my friends once said to me, "You're handling this with so much grace, but it's also okay if you want to vent or cry about it." And that to me meant so much more than saying, like, you're brave or you're inspirational, because I feel like those become rolled into a stereotype. Other really helpful things to say to people going through treatment, which I'm sure all of the people in this room will relate to, is, "Can I cook you dinner? Can I give you a ride to the hospital? Or can I walk your dog?" Then I'm going to come on to this, which I think a lot of people in the media are talking about now, which I think is important. It's the war on cancer and the battle metaphors. I can really see why the media tends to go with these metaphors and these terms. I get that they're intended to be really uplifting or motivational, but there's now actually research being published that some of these euphemisms are actually detrimental to patient care and treatment, which I find really interesting. First of all, cancer cells are technically your own cells that have just mutated. So am I supposed to be waging war on myself? Should I hate myself or my cells or my body? And how do I wage war on myself? Or specifically, how do I fight my mutated cells and leave the other cells? And what about those of us with incurable cancer or chronic cancer? Have we lost the battle? Are we survivors if it's never over for us? Or are we in a perpetual death match? I mean, it's difficult to think this way throughout your life and day-to-day basis to be thinking with this analogy going on in your head. It can be a bit tiring. So I often think instead of it being more like a symbiosis. I've been living with advanced metastatic cancer for nearly 2 years, and I just hope that all those cancer cells die, but I'm not thinking day to day about fighting them. I'm just thinking about having a good day. And what about those of us who are no longer on active treatment? Are those guys the winners? Because if you know anything about the new normal, I would say that nobody who's been diagnosed with cancer is a winner. So whether your chemo or your radiotherapy or your surgery works or it doesn't, it's not up to how hard you fought. The many beautiful souls that have died from bone cancer did not lose their battles. They are not lost. I'm hoping to convince you with these contradictions in mind that some of this language at times can be unhelpful. As a doctor, when I'm working in the hospital, I often have to go and see patients that have died and diagnose a death. I was trained to do this, not using any euphemisms or metaphors, and often there's family present when I go to diagnose a death. And when I go and see them, I don't say things like they've passed on or they've gone to a better place or they've lost their battle. I just simply always say gently, "I am so sorry to tell you that your loved one has died." I just want to say now, I know that can be triggering, so I'm really sorry to anyone in the room who has heard those words before. Lastly, I want to talk about the language that we use with ourselves. I want everyone in the room to think very carefully about the language that you use in your own mind with yourself. I want you to take a step back sometimes when your day is hectic or busy and recognize your thoughts. Are they catastrophizing? Are they angry? Are they scared? Are they sad? Are they hopeful? Take note of your inner dialogue, particularly the words in your mind that you say to yourself when you look in the mirror. Would you say those same words to your friend? Are the words supportive and kind? I hope that they are. When you're thinking about your diagnosis, or if you do, like me, have a future intertwined with cancer, I want you to refrain from using fixed statements about the future. It's taken me a long time to do this. I used to say things in my head like, oh, I'll probably die before that wedding happens next year. Or, oh, this treatment is bound to run out soon or stop working. I used to think that I was incurable. But like I said before, it's so important to think about the what ifs and the maybes. And now I try and make a point to keep myself open-minded and think things like, I'd love to go to that wedding next year. I can't wait to go. Or, I'm really glad this treatment is working for me right now. I'm really grateful for it. And if one day it stops working, I'll definitely recognize it. So I hope you can recognize the potential for changing your language. I know that there's always going to be a potential for changes in our lives and our diagnoses. There's always going to be setbacks or recurrences and treatment changes, but I hope you're not thinking about them on a day-to-day basis or expecting them. I want you to try and make room for the what-ifs, to fill your mind with hope and excitement for the future, where you can, when you can. Dream big and keep doing the prep work for the future that you most wish to have. Keep going for your goals. Forget about the values. Actually, you can have the values too. And keep telling yourself you can achieve it, because if you tell yourself you can't, then you definitely won't. But if you open your mind, choose your words carefully, and keep believing, then you can keep growing towards the best possible you. Thank you.